So we are going to begin with two excerpts, actually, from a video that was created by an Australian broadcasting company for Canada, because Canada had begun doing some exploration into their history of the treatment of Native Americans, and specifically on the topic of the Indian boarding schools, if you will. And this, the video at the start points out that the model for the schools that were created and run in Canada came from the United States. And so this video begins with a focus on the schools in the United States. So I'm going to ask you all to mute yourselves, if you would. That way you won't pop up on the recording. But probably one of you should be not muted so that you can tell me if you can or can't hear the video. I would hate to get 20 minutes into the video and find out nobody can hear anything. So who would like to volunteer? Have your microphone on and okay. And let me know, Maria, if there's any problem with being able to hear. Here we go.
This is so confusing and just hard to explain and hard to wrap your mind around it. Quite frankly, burning fire is one of the houses that I grew up in. I spent my high school years in that house. I lived in 5 houses in this town because we rented and we moved a lot. I visited all of them today. They're all gone, all of them. And for me, it's it's memories, and it's like scaffolding of memories, and it's gone. And like how do you deal with that? And I can't bring my kids here to show them in my childhood and how I grew up. But for thousands of
I'm hearing some conversation, but nothing from the video.
It's their home, it's their parents' home. The phone is full of text messages from the people in my childhood.
There it is.
Have you seen my house? Have you go by my house? What's left of it? And I gotta tell you, there's very little good news. We've had a little bit of good news with Leather Shop to go at it.
It feels like help is here, and the U.S. Forest Service.
Nope.
I'm not hearing it, Sue.
No video.
Just hearing somebody's background.
Yes.
Yep.
No audio. I'm not getting anything, Sue.
No audio yet.
I'm sorry, are you not able to hear or see this?
No, we can see it, but we can't hear it.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
They are doing voice overlay, Sue.
Yeah, but you really do need to hear it. Oh, heaven's sake.
There's a stable volume selector on our screen, whatever that means.
Yeah, I don't know. So you can hear me, but you can see the video, but you can't hear the video. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right.
That's
All right.
right.
Let me try one more time. Aha. Options.
Found it.
Share sound. Let's
Crazy
try that
team
magic
just
button.
might work, Sue.
Aha.
Of our people. It holds our identity, and it holds our practices, our beliefs, our philosophies, our worldviews, all inside the language. So our existence is directly tied to it.
There was the we.
Red Wing Thomas is one of a few who can speak Dakota, his tribe's language.
Practice this word with me. Say, emakiapi. Try it again. Emakiapi.
Less than 5% of my people, we don't know our language. We are on the verge of reclaiming it, but it's an uphill walk, and we have a long way to go. It took generations to wipe the language out. It's going to take generations to restore it. She ignored him.
He blames the US government's boarding school policy for destroying his people's culture.
As Native people, we've been severed from our language, from our culture, from our practices over a whole course of time. But the boarding school era, in the course of history, did a number on our people where we almost did not recuperate from it.
From 1819 to 1969, hundreds of thousands of Indigenous children were taken from their tribes and placed in state and church-run boarding schools across the US and its then territories. The schools, under the guise of education, were a dark experiment in assimilation. The model for the schools was devised by military officer Richard Henry Pratt, an Indian hunter. By stripping away culture, Pratt believed he could kill the Indian and save the man.
When you have a motto, kill the Indian, save the man, I mean, come on, that's as genocidal as it gets. The schools were created for one purpose only, and that was to destroy our belief system, to destroy our family system, and to change our identity.
By 1926, 83% of Native American children were enrolled in these institutions.
Everyone in this room literally descends from a boarding school survivor. I mean, that's just the truth.
Red Wing's grandfather, Albert, was sent to boarding school at the age of 8. He attended one of the largest and longest-running institutions, the Genoa U.S. Indian Industrial School in Nebraska.
He never really talked about it, and it wouldn't be until later, later in his life, where stories would be shared. One experience shared that a soiled sheet would be used to be wiped in the mouths of the other children who spoke their language. And if they didn't want those dirty sheets and soiled sheets shoved into their mouth, well, then you stop speaking your language and start speaking English. That's pretty hateful. That's pretty evil.
This entrance and a few buildings and barns are all that remain of the Indian Industrial School in Genoa. Once a sprawling campus housing children from more than 40 tribes. Today, it's a place where people come to learn the history of what happened here. This building, once the school's workshop, is now a museum run by the Genoa Foundation, a group of local volunteers.
Hi, Nancy. It's so good to see you.
Judy Gashkabash's mother, Eleanor, went to school here.
I'll let you look at your mom's window that was donated in her honor.
Like many survivors, her mother didn't talk about her time at boarding school.
She would talk about it, and there was sort of a haunting look or a sadness to the tone of her voice. She tried to tell the good things.
It says my mother's name there, but I don't know.
I don't have a lot of pictures of my mother because, for one thing, they made them be photographed for everything, and my mother detested having her picture taken. So I look at that photo they have, and I say, one of those girls is my mother. My mother cooked and baked breads and rolls and food that the children ate. However, most of the time they went to bed hungry.
To try to learn more, Judy began attending the school's reunions.
I started going to the Genoa Indian School reunions after my mother died, so I got to learn about what it was like and meet people that could have been at school with my mother.
The Genoa Foundation's secretary, Nancy Carlson, started the annual gatherings more than 30 years ago.
Former students were coming back, asking information about the school and saying they wanted reunions and this sort of thing. And so we thought, you know what? These people have this real need. Let's try to help them and do that.
3, good, super, I got you.
This reunion was the first. Filmed in 1990, these pictures have never been broadcast.
The first year I came, I stayed 2 years.
As the school has no living survivors, they offer a rare glimpse into what life was like for some former students.
So what was your day like? What time do you have to get up and all?
I have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. You never got any other time off to make up for it.
What did you learn here?
Well, I guess I don't know. I learned to, I'm not really sure. I guess I learned how to get along, with other people, strangers, being around strangers. Here too, I know.
This was just like a military school. We had to march everywhere we went. To dinner, we went to march. To church, we marched.
These were not schools. It was a prison camp, a work camp. It wasn't a lovely place to learn your education. They were little soldiers. Every morning, the whistles blew. You had to get out of bed. There was nothing of home. You were stripped of all your cultural belongings. Your hair, which is so sacred for the boys, was all cut off. It was a self-sufficient school, so the children were used as labor. You learned the 3 R's half the day, but it was a very watered-down curriculum. It wasn't stimulating. It wasn't with the goal that you could be anything. Dreams could come true at the Genoa Indian School for these children. No, the dream was you will be a servant.
Many students left the school with their culture broken. Others didn't return home at all.
What is important about where we're standing now, as far as you know?
Only that it's where we think the cemetery is. The only reason.
Why would there be a cemetery with the school?
Well, kids started dying at an early age. I mean, at the early time they were at the school. They had to do something with them. I don't think it was possible those days to send them home, the bodies, I mean. So they buried them here.
James Nash attended the school in the late 1920s. At the reunion, he revealed 2 of his classmates died at the school. He believes their deaths were covered up.
I searched the archives in Washington, D.C. for a week, and I never found any record whatsoever of these 2 deaths that I personally knew about.
Why do you think that is?
I think probably whoever was operating the Genoa Indian School had those records destroyed because they were derogatory to their image.
He took some of the people from the foundation board, or some of the guys, and they went out and they looked where he thought it was, but they couldn't find any markers or anything there. The next day they had like a grader that came in and just removed the topsoil to see if they could find where their graves, and they did not find anything. And so it was because of that they didn't find anything that they decided we were going to do this, set up a marker that's just to the east of this building to honor those former students that died.
The remains of 215 children, some as young as 3, buried for decades on the ground.
More unmarked graves uncovered at another Catholic residential school.
Last year in Canada, the discovery of mass graves at the sites of former boarding schools shocked the world. But with more than double the number of schools in the US, the government says tens of thousands of Indigenous children could have suffered the same fate.
At no time in history have the records or documentation of this policy been compiled or analyzed to determine the full scope of its reaches and effects. We must uncover the truth about the loss of human life and the lasting consequences of these schools.
A historic federal investigation into America's own boarding school era is now underway. In Nebraska's capital, Lincoln, Judy Gashkabash heads up the state's Commission on Indian Affairs. She says it's time to tell the truth about what happened at her mother's school.
When we first heard about what was going on in Canada, I said, we've got to focus on the children that died here. A cemetery at a school is not the norm. That you could die at school and then you're going to be buried out the door.
This whole history is almost invisible. People aren't aware of the fact that we're going to find these kind of graves. We're going to find missing children here in the United States too.
Judy asked historian Dr. Margaret Jacobs to find out how many children died at Genoa.
When I started trying to find out what happened to the children who died, the first place I looked was the government records. Nothing. So that's when I started doing some newspaper searches.
She soon began uncovering reports of students' deaths.
Spinal paralysis, heart failure. There's a lot of accidental deaths. We've come across a drowning, a child who was hit by a train. Their diseases were sweeping through these schools, but in many cases they weren't returning the children to their homes when they died, and they were burying them on site. And it's just kind of chilling to me, you know, to think that for so many children, the schools were death traps.
Those who grew up in Genoa knew and understood what happened here. It was a point that we were taught in school about Native American boarding schools, assimilation, but we weren't aware of the cemetery. At least I know myself, I didn't stop to think about the students that died here, what happened to them.
Nikki Drews volunteers with the Genoa Foundation and is helping investigate student deaths. She recently discovered more children had died.
We have found 86 students that have died, but without having the actual government records, it's hard to say how many there really are. It's almost 100% that there are more students that have died.
One of the 86 children who died at Genoa was Carolyn Fiskus's aunt, Mildred Lowe.
I have an old picture of my grandmother and my Aunt Mildred, and Mildred looks like she's about 3 years. And they're wearing white people's clothes and shoes. My auntie must have moved, you know how little kids wiggle.
In 1927, Mildred Lowe was taken from the Winnebago tribe and sent across the plains of Nebraska to school in Genoa.
They put her on the train and it started moving, and that train whistle would blow, and then she got to Genoa and she got off, and that was how it was. It was horrible, lonely and scary.
Mildred died 3 years later. She was 12 years old.
To lose a child and then to lose them in that way, you don't know what happened to them. It's a very sad story for our family. This is my wall of fame of my family. This is my mom and dad. This is on their 50th wedding anniversary, I think. We had this taken. My dad's a little bald-headed white guy, and my mom is Ho Chunk. And then this is my son and daughter, their graduation pictures. And these is my pride and joy, my grandchildren. Put my Aunt Mildred up there with my grandmother. There they are. For me, it's like this is missing, this piece.
Carolyn has spent the last decade trying to find out what happened to Mildred after she died.
She's probably at the spirit world, but she didn't get a send-off. But everybody's there. We believe our ancestors are there to greet her. But, you know, we want her spirit to know that we know that too.
Carolyn has recently received Mildred's death certificate. It reveals Mildred died from influenza and meningitis.
When I got it, I was like, oh, you know, just reading that is just kind of like you say, oh, now this is real. She really did die there. And here's the evidence. And it's hard. I think it's hard for me. Pray for all the spirits who haven't come home yet. Pray for them to find their way on this smudge and on this smoke.
The document states Mildred's body was sent home to the Winnebago reservation, but Carolyn is skeptical.
They didn't have any record of her being buried in the Winnebago cemetery. And my grandmother's record was there, but we didn't have Mildred.
She believes Mildred was buried at Genoa, in the school's lost cemetery.
I'm going to skip a little of that and continue with the same video.
Eight of the children who lost their lives in Genoa belong to Nebraska's Omaha tribe.
You know, they're speaking from the grave. You know, that's just how we see it. We're here. Find us, bring us home.
Chairman Leander Merrick says if the cemetery is found, the Omaha tribe will repatriate their children and lay them to rest on their ancestral lands.
They have to come home. This is their home. To bring them back here is going to bring closure for them, their spirits, and their loved ones, and our community as a whole. This is shining a light on the United States. It's not a good light. They wanted to eradicate us. They didn't want us to be a threat to them because of what they were doing. You know, the bottom line is they wanted our land.
Across the country, Native American tribes are mobilizing as they begin searching for their lost children. There are calls for a reckoning for the trauma caused by boarding schools. Dr. Samuel Torres is from the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, based in Minneapolis.
This moment, as hard as it was, has been an important moment to remind folks from every background that this is an important part of the story of the forming of the United States of America, that this land was once Indian land, and it still is, and it always will be.
He says there needs to be a commission of inquiry as the first step towards reconciliation.
Boarding school survivors are not getting any younger, and there's a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of information that needs to be shared. Truth cannot be done without a focus on accountability and justice, and only through that can substantive healing actually take place.
For Red Wing, Keeping the culture alive is key to healing from a painful past.
So in my classroom, we reverse it. For the ones who had to go through it. So we reverse it. Instead, it's a happy atmosphere. Instead, it's joyous and it's exciting and it's enthusiastic. And it's everything that our ancestors were forbidden to have. That's why there's so much energy in my room. It's for them.
This is real. They really were here. It was 20 years ago that I was last here, and we're still looking for those children that died.
In Genoa, the recent search failed to locate the cemetery.
They're there somewhere. We know they're under the ground somewhere, and they need to be honored.
Efforts to find the children who never came home continue.
I can't rest until I feel I've exhausted every possible avenue to find the children.
Zingarato maka piga is
So, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland initiated a study of the history of the Indian boarding schools, and it was done in two parts. So I'm going to share a brief video of Deb speaking about the release of part one of the report. And as you watch and listen, I think you will see how much it means to her personally, as well as in her position as Secretary of the Department of the Interior.
A new report by the Interior Department has documented the deaths of 500 indigenous children at Indian boarding schools run or supported by the federal government in the United States, but the actual death toll is believed to be far higher. The report also located 53 burial sites at former schools, which were run for over a century. The report marks the first time the Department of Interior has documented some of the horrific history of the schools, known for their brutal assimilation practices, forcing students to change their clothing, language, and culture. The report was ordered by Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, who is a member of the Laguna Pueblo. Her grandparents were forced to attend boarding school at the age of 8. She spoke on Wednesday.
For more than a century, tens of thousands of indigenous children were taken from their communities and forced into boarding schools run by the U.S. government, specifically the Department of the Interior and religious institutions. When my maternal grandparents were only 8 years old, they were stolen from their parents' culture and communities and forced to live in boarding schools until the age of 13. Many children like them never made it back to their homes. The federal policies that attempted to wipe out Native identity, language, and culture continue to manifest in the pain tribal communities face today, including cycles of violence and abuse, disappearance of Indigenous people, premature deaths, poverty and loss of wealth, mental health disorders, and substance abuse. Recognizing the impacts of the federal Indian boarding school system cannot just be a historical reckoning. We must also chart a path forward to deal with these legacy issues. The fact that I am standing here today as the first Indigenous Cabinet Secretary is testament to the strength and determination of Native people. I am here because my ancestors persevered. I stand on the shoulders of my grandmother and my mother, and the work we will do with the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative will have a transformational impact on the generations who follow.
There is a video called The American Experience, where two individuals who lived at an Indian boarding school share their experiences. Sorry, that's the wrong video. Hold on.
By the late 19th century, the Indian Wars were over. The United States seized on a ruthless strategy to assimilate Native children to a subordinate place in white-dominated society. Government-run boarding schools.
I was 5 years old. My mother was crying and they were taking us off, and my sister Audrey, who also, you know, was like a second mother to me, and a very close friend as a sister. And my brother Mark, they were very sad. Within 2 hours or so after the buses filled up and we were down the road, this is the furthest I've ever been from my home in my life. And then, of course, it turns into evening, and we arrive at this place.
I ended up in a place where nothing made any sense at all. You know, it wasn't home. It wasn't. I didn't know anything about school. Nobody ever told me anything about school. I didn't know what the education was. I remember that I wanted to go home, period. I didn't want to be there, I just wanted to go home.
And we all had to strip down naked, and then they put the DDT on us. They line us up, they're cutting our hair. You have long hair, you have braids, and then that gets cut off. And I would say within a matter of an hour and a half, we're standing there, all looking alike.
Between the 1870s and the 1960s, over 100,000 Indian children were sent to one of the nearly 500 boarding schools scattered across the United States.
Through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
We couldn't sing any native songs or tribal songs. They just started using English. You could not use any other language. And we'd whisper it past the Bequajigan, pass the bread over. It's like I had to be two people. I had to be Noah Cummig, I had to be Dennis Banks. Noah Cummig is my real name, my Ojibwe name. Dennis Banks had to be very protective of Noah Cummig. And so I learned who the presidents were, and I learned the math, I learned the social studies, I learned the English, and now Cummig was still there.
This is education that was promised us, that was guaranteed us through the treaties. But it wasn't. It's torture, brainwashing. They called us many different names. Savage, dumb. And we got beat for looking like an Indian, smelling like an Indian, even speaking Indian. Everything I did.
Their de-Indianization program, it failed. But the toll was devastating. It destroyed our family. It destroyed the relationship we had with our mother. I could never regain that friendship, loveship relationship that I had with my mother. It wasn't there anymore. And that's what, to this day, I keep thinking that, damn this government, what it did to me, and what it did to thousands of other children across this country.
The study that Secretary Holland commissioned concluded its work in the middle of last year, and on July 30th, they produced their report. This is audio only.
This message comes from Home Instead. Home Instead knows that if you leave.
The Department of the Interior released its final report today on the history of federal Indian boarding schools. This after a years-long campaign by Secretary Deb Haaland to examine the federal government's role in the system. For more than a century, it pulled Native children from their homes and sought to erase their languages and culture. NPR's Sequoia Carrillo has been following the story. Hey there.
Hi.
What are the key findings?
Yes, well, for one thing, this 3-year investigation in many ways finally delivered upon the administration's promise to take ownership of the boarding school system. It's saying, yes, the U.S. did this, the U.S. government did this, and footed the bill for a system that we can now see hurt communities and hurt children. This report confirms the number of children who died while at these schools, 973, but it says the total is likely higher than that. And when talking about loss of that scale over generations, it's hard to think of a way to make that right, and the report acknowledges that.
Well, and speak for a moment, Sequoia, about those generations of children. This whole boarding school system was left out of American history for so long. Just remind people how it affected Native children.
Absolutely. So the federal boarding school system operated from the early 1800s until 1969. During this time, in many areas of the country, it was standard practice to remove children from their families, sometimes as early as 4 years old, and send them to boarding schools to forcibly assimilate to the United States. What that looked like in practice was often a school funded by the U.S. government, but run by a religious organization, and sometimes patrolled by military forces. The schools were known to cut students' hair upon arrival and wash their mouths out with soap if they spoke their native languages. There are many documented reports of verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. To create a system of this size, it was over 400 schools in 37 different states. It took money, and this report puts that figure, adjusted for inflation, at $23 billion in today's dollars, invested to create and maintain the system. So now the report is recommending an investment of at least that amount to try to walk back some of the harm done.
At least $23 billion. So a lot of money that
Yes.
it's calling for to try to rebuild families and communities. How exactly would it work?
The report doesn't just ask for one lump sum. It's encouraging spending on multiple programs like family reunification, language revitalization, and of course, Indian education. Programs intended to address the ways that the boarding school system just wreaked havoc on tribal communities for so long. There's a proposal for a national memorial to acknowledge the harm to tribes and individuals, and lots about educating the public, whether that's through the memorial or the oral histories that they've been gathering.
And I saw this report also calls for a formal apology from the U.S. government. Is that likely to happen?
Someone asked this today, actually, on the press call that Secretary Holland held, and she apologized right there on the spot. The secretary is a member of the Laguna Pueblo, and this has been very deeply personal work. She kind of teared up talking about it. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's different than a presidential apology, but she didn't make it feel that far out of the question. She said she has the full support of the president on this work. But with an election coming up this November, we'll see what can come of it.
And Pierre Sequoia Carrillo, thank you.
Thank you.
This is not supposed to be part of can't make it stop. So if you want Girl Scout cookies,
we're not seeing anything about Girl Scout cookies. Oh.
We're not seeing anything or hearing anything.
Add the Girl Scout s'mores cream filling to that stuff between your tiles. Caulk.
Yeah, that.
Aha, I got rid of it. All right, one more.
In an historic first, President Biden today delivered an apology for a U.S. policy that forcibly separated generations of indigenous children from their families for more than 150 years, sending them to federally backed boarding schools for forced assimilation into white society.
I formally apologize as President of the United States of America for what we did. I formally apologize. I have a solemn responsibility to be the first president to formally apologize to the Native peoples. Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, Native Alaskans, and federal Indian boarding schools. It's long, long, long overdue. Quite frankly, there's no excuse that this apology took 50 years to make. The federal Indian boarding school policy, the pain it has caused, will always be a significant mark of shame, a blot on American history.
Interior Secretary Deb Haaland launched an investigation into the boarding school system shortly after she became the first Native American to lead the department. The investigation uncovered generations of abuse and trauma and the deaths of at least 973 Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children who attended the boarding schools. The Washington Post's Dana Hedgepeth has been covering the story, and she attended the ceremony today in Arizona. And she joins us now. Thanks for being with us. This is a part of U.S. history that most Americans know little about, the federal government's abusive boarding school system. Remind us of what the federal investigation found.
Jeff, thank you so much for having me. It has been a historic day here in Phoenix, just outside of Phoenix on the Gila River School. The investigation started with Secretary Deb Haaland, who should be noted for being the first Native American cabinet secretary, which that alone tells you something. Deb Holland, this issue was so personal for her. Her grandparents, her great-grandfather went to Indian boarding schools. She took this as a major initiative during her time under the Biden administration, launched a 3-year, $21 million investigation looking into boarding schools. What makes that remarkable is that she was the first person. She was the first Interior Secretary. She's investigating the very department that ran these 400-plus boarding schools across the country. No one had looked at this history in 150 years. A very troubled history of wrongdoings, mistreatment, physical, sexual, emotional, mental abuse. 973 of those children did not make it home. They died at those schools, Jeff. Her investigation alone was quite remarkable and historic in and of itself, and found, as you mentioned, that the children who died there, some in marked, some in unmarked graves, sadly, those that did make it home were very traumatized. They were abused, mistreated. They did not receive the fullest of education. They did manual labor, which President Biden noted to today. They learned the very basics of academics. Secretary Holland today mentioned that when many people think of boarding schools, they think of an elite education. I was so refreshed to hear her bring this up because this was so far from being elite education. This was not at all elite. So Helen revealed all that in her investigation, and this was the culmination of that work. She asked for an apology, a presidential level apology, and that's what she got today from President Biden, Jeff.
Yeah, the first time a U.S. president has apologized for the atrocities suffered by tens of thousands of Native children. How was it received?
As you could hear from the clip you played of President Biden, I sort of smiled and got a slight chill. There was cheers, there were survivors, some of whom I've talked to are just, they're heroes, they're special people. There were tears. Many folks said, I talked to Holland's Assistant Secretary, Brian Newland, his own relatives. He has experience of this at boarding schools. He was her point person on her investigation and said, I have so many mixed emotions today. Those mixed emotions being a sense of sadness for those who did not make it home, a sense of gratefulness, as he said, that this time has finally come. Those who did not make it home and those who survived are getting the acknowledgement, and that means so much to Native people, to be acknowledged on this dark and forgotten chapter of American history.
Understanding the importance of the acknowledgement. A question, though, what, if any, action follows this apology?
Well, we'll have to see. There was a lot of reaction afterwards of people saying sort of what next. The Washington Post, I was part of a team this summer that published a very extensive report where we looked at the sexual abuse specifically at many of these schools that were run by not just the U.S. government, but by religious groups and churches. In our investigation, the Washington Post found that 122 priests, brothers, and nuns at 22 schools across the United States sexually abused Native American children. The Catholic Church, the Pope, has yet to apologize for the atrocities here in the U.S. He did do an apology several years ago in Canada, and that was seen and heard. And many Native American survivors here in the U.S. would like to see him, that's the next step, do that same apology here in the U.S. Many Native Americans also, this was brought up today in reaction, is that an apology is the first step of healing. We heard this over and over again from many folks who were present and those who are advocates in this arena. An apology is that first step in healing, Jeff, acknowledging a dark history, forgotten chapter of the U.S. history. It's not just Native American history. This is all of our history. Deb Parker of NABS, the Healing Coalition that has been working on this issue, would like to see, I know, more money spent for language, cultural revitalization. These very things that were stripped from generations of people has left a gap in the knowledge and the passing to younger generations. It was very powerful today to see people, not just Native elders, but also young people, teenagers. Those folks, there's a gap in knowledge, and that needs to be closed. And the only way to do that is with funding for cultural revitalization programs and language programs. There's many folks who've never talked about this history. And I really think Biden stepping forward, speaking of it, we cannot underestimate how powerful that is to be acknowledged.
Dana Hedgepeth of the Washington Post, thanks so much.
I have a summary of the report, a one screen that talks about the actions that this investigation recommends. But I wanted to stop and have an opportunity for any questions or comments, reactions, reflections.
It's not the first time I've heard this number, but it's shocking to me this went on until the 60s, 1960s. I can't imagine people being so mean as to snatch children from their families.
I spent the first 25 years of my life in Nebraska, and I never heard of the Genoa, we called it city Indian school. I knew of reservations, but never heard of that school before. I lived in Phoenix area for a while, and there is a major street in Phoenix named Indian School Road. Um, this is a very, very sad issue, but in all honesty, it's just part of the iceberg that relates to the history of the invaders that came to the United States, of which we're all descendants, I guess, and the way in which the Native Americans were treated. If you ever take I-90 west and go through South Dakota, I strongly encourage you to stop at a place called the Lakota Sioux Indian Museum on the Missouri River, when 90 crosses the Missouri River just before going west. It's a great revelation of a lot of things that have gone on out there. It led Kitty and I to spend some time going to the Wounded Knee. There's a book called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and it's a very pathetic little community. It's the Indians, Native Americans in the United States have really been treated very badly.
For additional treatment of this, the most exhaustive treatment I've seen, and maybe the best, is a book called The Rediscovery of America by Ned Blackhawk, he's a professor at Yale and a member of the Western Shoshone tribe, and it is exhaustive from the beginning of the country through the 20th century. And it's eye-opening. It was for me.
It leaves me wondering what's going on in Delaware, and I did just a really quick look a day or two ago, and there is some work, but boy, it just seems pretty tiny and in need of support. A little sliver of land that was repatriated, and it was next to a firing range, and there it was ancestral burial ground with this firing range next to it, and there sounds like one dedicated person trying to clean it up. But I also listened to a Presbyterians for Earth Care webinar last night with two speakers, one of whom talked about working with Native tribes and using the Presbyterian Tree Fund to help. I'd have to look at the recording again to see just what was going on, but it just gave me a little thought of, could we do something in Delaware?
I think about how could the children had no idea how to get home from where they were, and how did their families know how to get to the children? I mean, every ounce of this scheme was just evil to wipe them out, destroy them. It's just horrific.
The concept of assimilation, that the only way to succeed is to become as white as possible.
So incredibly sad to see the pictures of the Native Americans with their hair and native clothing, and then all shorn.
And virtually everywhere in the United States were tribal lands at one time. I was struck a few years ago when I began getting involved in some programs that were put on by the Episcopal Church in Delaware. And every program that I went to began not just with prayer, but with an acknowledgement that we were standing on Native American grounds and identifying the tribe or the tribes to whom those lands had belonged. That oral, verbal acknowledgement of whose land it was not something I had ever experienced before. It was very powerful.
I do believe that Presbyterians have done the same thing. At least the one of the sessions I attended downstate, they started off with that recognition. So that has spread to other places.
Yeah, the first time I was on a call, and that was everybody was expected to say that, and I was really, everybody else knew what tribes had owned the land. I was really embarrassed I didn't.
One of the comments was made was the importance of an apology. We didn't hear a lot about the role of religious organizations specifically in running these schools, although they played a huge role. And the issue of the Pope's apology for the schools in Canada, but not in the United States. But just before this report was released back last July, in June, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a formal apology for the Catholic Church's role in the U.S. of inflicting, quote, a history of trauma to Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, and the Native Hawaiian community, and affirmed its official repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. And that conference also issued a series of recommendations on action that should be taken. So the Pope has not officially done the same, but the Catholic Church in the United States has acknowledged its role and apologized.
So didn't you say you would go over some of the actions that were recommended?
Yes, I did. Let me do that. So a summary of the report, which you heard, 417 institutions across 37 states and then territories. At least 973 children died. It's quite apparent that that number was likely very much higher. There were at least 74 marked and unmarked burial sites at 65 different schools, and the US government over time appropriated more than $23 billion in fiscal year 23 inflation adjusted dollars between 1871 and 1969 for this process, for these institutions. And so the final report, number one, was to issue a formal acknowledgement and apology from the US government, which has occurred. Next, to invest in remedies to the present day impacts. And we heard that on the podcast, the woman speaking about the ways in which, they're asking that a similar sum to that which was appropriated to run the schools be appropriated to address the consequences. Create a national memorial to acknowledge and commemorate the experience. Identify and repatriate the remains of children. the school in Genoa has undertaken an extensive search to find the cemetery they believe is located there. And in 2023, they abandoned that project. They had not been able to find a burial site. They are convinced there is one there, but they've not been able to locate it. Return the former federal Indian boarding school sites to the tribes, tell the stories so that Americans and the world know what happened, invest in further research about the present day consequences, and then work with organizations in other countries that have similar histories of attempts at assimilation. And one has to ask oneself, on January 9th, 2025, the likelihood of the US government appropriating $23 billion for this purpose.
Where does that January 9th date come? I'm sorry, I came in late.
That's today's date.
Oh, there is actually money appropriated?
Oh, I'm saying, as we sit here in the United States on January 9th, 2025, what would we assess is the likelihood that the United States government is going to appropriate $23.3 billion.
When we need more, that we need almost double that they're anticipating right now for the damage in California.
It seems to me that the only hope is states, at least for the next 4 years.
Perhaps states and perhaps supported by religious institutions. I mean, perhaps there are, every state is likely different. Every state has its own tribes, its own history. And there might be ways. Obviously, in some states, there were 45 of these schools. I don't think it showed any in Delaware, but certainly in Pennsylvania. And so, and some of the things that they're asking for, which is telling the story so that Americans know the history, is something that can be done without an act of Congress. I mean, that can be done. We can be engaged and involved in doing that.
One of the things this nascent effort in Delaware include or strives to have a museum. I'm going to run upstairs and get that.
I just wanted to share that a couple things. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So just in response to the thing that you were recognizing about land acknowledgement, there was an article that was just in the New York Times. It's an editorial. I think it was just this past week. It's by Kathleen Duvall. And interestingly, she is sort of arguing with skepticism about the land acknowledgements. Her comments are enough with the land acknowledgements. I think the perspective is that it's not enough. It's like, it's like, okay, let's say, okay, this happened. Now let's eat our meal and move on. And the point is that it's not enough to just make people more aware of the disposition and violence that had occurred in the establishment of the U.S. Instead of these acknowledgments, the argument is trying to make it that there are now 574 federally recognized tribes. So instead, what state governments and universities and nonprofits ought to be doing is figuring out, well, how can we partner with them to help them thrive and sustain and so on. And that's what I don't think it has to be an either or. I don't think I'm in agreement with her point of view that enough with it. I think you do both because one can help, I think, feed the other.
Yeah.
But it is a shame that I don't know of anything local, or we're not readily aware of ways to become more involved or helpful in this
So
regard.
so maybe we could find out. Let me ask a question. How many of you have been to the Nanticoke powwow? I would suggest you go. I've only been once, but it was a very significant experience, just in terms of observing and being part of a community of Native Americans and their dress and their customs and their music. And it's in October, I think. Watch for it. It's well worth experiencing.
Good to know. The second thing I just wanted to quickly share is that I went to school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, at Dickinson College, and just down the road is the Army War College, where colonels and generals go for their, I guess, senior officer kinds of advanced training and classes and so on. And anyway, that was an Indian boarding school.
Mm-hmm.
And I just now pulled it up, and if you look on their website, it's all benign language. It is like, oh, they educated about 1,000 students, Indian students, in English and vocations. And Jim Thorpe actually went there, where he played football and then went on to become an Olympian. And what's interesting is that their slogan was "Kill the Indian, save the man," and it's just disgusting. We're the savages. We're the bad guys.
No kidding. No kidding. Well, as I think the one Dakota man commented, that's about as genocidal as you get, right?
That Carlisle school was a Quaker school, and the idea that we're gonna, make their lives better because we're gonna educate them. That's what the thinking was that time. My friend, who's a Quaker, has done a lot of research on the Quaker boarding schools, and he actually got Haverford College to provide a grant for him to have a bunch of people for a period of time to photocopy or digitalize 20,000 documents about the boarding schools. And one interesting thing that he came upon was, and I'm not really equipped with the details of this. I was hoping that he would show up here tonight, but he found a story of somebody in New England that was a Native American that actually asked the Quakers to help educate Native American children. And I don't know what tribe it was, but it's interesting how they were seen by a Native American as a way to assimilate. So I think we were all kind of shaming our, the background of Quakers. And then when he came upon that, it was very interesting, very interesting. But also the work that I've been studying, as a voyeur. I'm not really a historian or anything. I just like to dig around because I'm fascinated with the origins of our country. The Native Americans that were sent out to, the Trail of Tears or various other ways that they ended up in reservations, different places, and the people that can claim Native American heritage when they say, I'm a Lenape here living on the East Coast, and those that were sent on reservations that can claim to be 100% Lenape, you put those two in a room and it's friction. It's just, that's just an amazing thing that I've noticed some at Penn, they have discussions sometimes, and one person will be on a panel discussion that's got Native American 100%, DNA, and then another that doesn't, and they'll just go at it. So there's a lot of delicate things that happen when you get into this, these discussion rooms, especially,
And I don't want to cut you off, Bev, but we try to keep these to be 1 hour programs and
Okay,
no more
sorry,
than an
sorry.
hour 15 because we want to
Yeah.
be respectful of people's time.
Okay.
And we keep seeing this theme over and over again in our country's history, that that concept of white supremacy, that white people are superior to everyone else and are rightfully the dominant group in society and get to call the shots. And we tend to think about that term in the context of African Americans or Black people, but our history and our current state are replete with that mindset, and it bears discussion, it bears uncovering, it bears acknowledgement and action. So I want to thank you all for being here this evening, and look forward to seeing you. Our Thursday evening series is now resumed after a brief hiatus over the holidays. And so we'll look forward to seeing you next week. And I think many of you know that Lynn Keelhorn, who is almost the founder of the campaign to end debtor's prison in the state of Delaware, the nonprofit organization that she founded, that Miriam Dede is now the head of, will be putting on a program on January 17th via Zoom. And it should be an excellent, excellent program with some great speakers. So I hope you're all able to participate in that. We've sent out a lot of notices about it. If you're not aware, I'd be happy to share that information with you. And I think, Chris, did you put in the chat that the Nanticoke powwow is actually in June? Oops, well, you're muted, but I think the chat piece said in June. So anyway.
It said New Jersey. I was wondering if there's.
Oh, was that one in New Jersey? Oh, okay. Yeah, this is downstate Delaware.
Right.
Either you can look it up. Well, you look it up. Find out when it is.
It's in the Millsboro, Delaware area.
Yes.
There's a Nanticoke Museum there, and they also hold it in Hudson Field, which is right along Route 1.
Yes.
Before you get down to Lewis, Delaware. So
a lot of parking needed for the
exactly.
event. Yeah, but it's quite something. So anyway, once again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Sue. Another great
you.
job.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. It was really
Thank
good.
you.
Good night.
Great topic. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you all.